I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so thanks, Olivia, for introducing me. My name is indeed Edward. I'm really happy to see so many of you here again for this third session. Even if it's over Zoom, yeah, I think you're probably the largest audience of peers that I've had, which makes it a little scary, but at the same time, I'm really happy to have the chance to share some of my thoughts and research insights into this phenomenon that is the global estimates on child labor. And these insights are mainly based on my PhD and on the development of international child labor law and my current postdoc on target 8.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I hope I will provide some stimulus for the conversations later in the breakout rooms. What reassures me is that as one of the conveners of this research series, I'll probably decide whether this video goes online or not, depending on how this goes. So, a few disclaimers before I start. This is not going to be a very careful breakdown and discussion of the new estimates. I would invite everyone who wants to know exactly what the latest findings are about, just read the report. It's freely available on the ILO website, and it's written in a very clear and concise language. But instead, I'm going to try to place and problematize the global estimates within what I would call the global child labor regime. And by this, I mean the international apparatus that is designed and controlled mainly by the ILO, and within the ILO by the trade unions, to standardize or universalize the way we think, speak, and deal with child labor. So the rest of the presentation will continue as follows. First, we'll talk a little bit about the new estimates, as I just mentioned, and I will try to shed some light on the ways they are, or the two main ways they're instrumentalized by the ILO, which is advocacy and global policy. I will then try to explain how this came to be by providing a brief historical overview of the rise of the global estimates. Then I will try to make clear why I believe this is problematic by looking at the statistical architecture behind the numbers and by problematizing the gathering of national data on which the global estimates are based. Then I will briefly conclude by summarizing what I believe is some of the sense and nonsense of the global estimates as they are currently used. Okay. So I think that many of you will not have missed that the ILO, and together with UNICEF for the first time this year, has published its new global estimates on child labor about 2 weeks ago, on June the 10th. They always make a huge media splash and then go on to dictate the international discourse and debate around child labor. Like I wrote in the abstract of the presentation, it's very difficult to open any kind of publication that does not mention the latest estimates in the very first paragraph often. Which takes us to the first major function they hold, or otherwise said, the major way in which they are instrumentalized, which is of course for awareness and advocacy purposes and fundraising as well. So the whole world talks about child labor for a while, and everyone that needs a hook to speak about the subject is provided with an easy and clean opening, right? There are currently 160 million child laborers in the world. Now, whether this is problematic or not depends on how these numbers are presented and represented. As we see here on the picture, the number are often combined with pictures of children working in extremely exploitative conditions, some of the so-called worst forms of child labor. And this is a screenshot of Kailash Satyarthi. Most of you will know him as the front man of the Global March Against Child Labor, who was also a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He was given it together with Malala in 2014. And he's very much the poster boy for the ILO. He always gets invited to everything. And also this year, he was invited to speak during an ILO event, online ILO event, surrounding the launch of the global estimates. And those of you who have seen him before or who know him, know that he almost only speaks about children being sold as slaves, as animals, and the like. So in short, the number is convoluted with merely negative and disturbing images and stories, which no doubt hold some reality hold some truth in reality, but as you will later see, they are not representative of the very diverse and complex reality that hides behind the number of 160 million children in child labor. What is by far the most interesting about the latest global estimates is that for the first time since 2002, when they were first published, as we know them now, it shows an increase in child labor instead of a decline. And I think it's important to say that this is actually not because of COVID. The data on which this is based does not include 2020, but they project that COVID will add another 9 million or so child laborers in the coming years. The next slide shows that the increase is due to an increase in sub-Saharan Africa, and this number was already on the rise in the previous global estimates. The estimated number in the other regions in which child labor is prevalent has actually gone down. Another still from the report shows us that agriculture still accounts for the largest share of child labor, and within this category, most children work within the family. However, it's also important to note that household chores are not counted. Now, to make a little bridge to sort of the policy function that these global estimates hold, I think that everyone can agree that data on anything, including child labor, is important to set priorities, to allocate resources, to monitoring progress, and to evaluate programs. It's even critical for our understanding of the determinants and conditions and for the design of social protection programs and policies. Now, national or local data is often used in this sense for national and local policy. But as we will see later on, the ILO has brought all these national numbers together to give us global estimates and actually use these as the basis, indicator, and justification of the ILO's abolition agenda and the global child labor regime at large. So this is thus the second major function or major way in which they are instrumentalized. They are presented as sort of the empirical glue between the ILO's normative mandate to oversee the abolition of child labor and its effect towards that end via global policy and advocacy. Just to give an example, first, for those who briefly for those who are not familiar with the legal basis of the abolition approach, the ILO Convention 138 states that this is a global goal, the effective abolition of child labor, and that basically in most countries, the ILO allows children to do full-time work the day they turn 14, unless the legal schooling age is higher. So basically all work done by younger children, so 13 years and younger, is child labor and should thus be abolished. There's two exceptions, which is light work, which is basically work done by children of 12 and 13 years outside school hours, and there is hazardous work, which is likely to jeopardize a child's health, safety, and morals, which is not allowed for anyone under 18 years unless they are very well protected. Now, the only thing that Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor basically adds is things like slavery, child soldier, prostitution, that these should also be considered hazardous forms of child labor. It doesn't actually present any sort of new standard or legal requirements to countries. Okay, so to give an example how the global estimates sort of tie these things together, so the normative framework of the ILO and the policy apparatus that follows it. As many of you will know, 2021 is the international year, the UN International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. And if you look at the UN document on which this is based, you will see that this is done so to help progress towards the 2025 goal of the Sustainable Development Goals, in which countries have agreed to end all forms of child labor by 2025. And again, this is based on the global estimates. So the estimates are used as an indicator of progress towards this end. But much more than that, I think that it's important to know that the decline in child labor as presented by the global estimates since 2002 has been used by the ILO as proof that their abolition campaign or their approach is working. So therefore, it's interesting now that the numbers have risen, and we'll get back to that. Okay, so in the next section, we're going to briefly just discuss how this came to be and why I believe this is problematic. So to put it bluntly, the ILO did not really care about child labor up until the 1979 UN International Year of the Child, when it started to take its own active role in dealing with child labor more seriously. At that time, the yearbook of labor statistics showed that an estimate of 52 million children were in child labor, or at least people under the age of 15. Now, the Director General of the ILO, in his report about this, said actually, or he raised three major problems, right? First, the definitional problem. What is child? What is work? What is labor? How do we count this? The second, that there's a tendency to hide this kind of work or hide this kind of information when people are asked. And then third, that most children work in informal traditional sectors where the tools to actually gain this type of data are not actually available. And based on this, he basically concluded that global figures perpetrating to demonstrate the extent of child labor are not very meaningful. They may have dramatic effects, but they do not offer a basis for policy. In view of these reservations, I hesitate to even advance any figures. In themselves, they tell us nothing about the nature of the work that children are doing or the circumstances and conditions under which this is being done. This was in 1983, a lot has changed, but as we will see, also not that much has changed. Then in 1989, for the 10th anniversary of the International Year of the Child, the ILO published another child labor report, now estimating the number at 80 million. And again, this was based on very standard labor statistics database. And again, the ILO director, Francis Blanchard, said that the official international statistics reflect but a fraction of children actually working. I think what was very important for the way that we see child labor actually, and we use the global estimates, was the Smoky Mountain project in 1989. So very shortly, the ILO offered the government of the Philippines some assistance for helping children that worked on this huge garbage dump in Manila called the Smoky Mountain. And I interviewed one of the ILO officers who was responsible for this project. And he said that to me, this project was a tool of advocacy, right? Imagine from a media point of view, these children working on this mountain of garbage that is smoking and burning all the time under very, very difficult conditions. After that, it was easy for us to mobilize resources for the international program on the elimination of child labor, IPAC, and later, of course, for the new convention on the worst forms of child labor. So now with this realization that the power of such shocking images came the realization that global figures could further aid this advocacy and fundraising goal, right? So in the same interview, he said basically about global estimates that the quantification was extremely important part of our work, because I personally saw the power of numbers and statistics as an advocacy tool. This was the first time that we started gathering statistics, both global types of statistics and country level statistics on child labor. And that made all the difference in the world, because the figures started to attract media attention. Again, you can see how the two were convoluted, sort of these worst forms of child labors, or at least images thereof, and giving sort of a global figure to go along with that. In 1992, IPAC, as most of you will know, was founded, the ILO's international program on the elimination of child labor, and coming up with more reliable data for more accurate global estimates was one of the first tasks, really. And this led to a first sort of unofficial global estimate in 1996, which was a little bit more, based on more expansive data than the previous numbers, but still not the way it's now. But this was done in a report called Targeting the Intolerable, which was published in 1996. And this was basically a report that sort of explained why we need a convention on the worst forms of child labor, but it also mentioned that the ILO estimates about 250 million children in child labor. Now, again, the ILO convoluted the very narrow and sensational understanding of child labor as the worst forms, slavery, prostitution, etc., with global figures that covers all sorts of forms and sorts of working children. But it was a huge success, and as the former IPAC director said at the time, the number drew international attention to the magnitude and scope of child labor worldwide. It was widely publicized. Hardly any article on child labor failed to mention it. And so, building on this success, in 1998, the ILO created the Statistical Information and Monitoring Program on Child Labor, which is called SIMPOC, as part of IPAC to produce more transparent, accurate, detailed, and comparable data on child labor worldwide, which led to the first set of official global estimates in 2002, and sort of the series that followed until the global estimates that were published this year. I'm just going to take a glass of water. All right, so what is actually behind this number of 160 million children? Now, to make it simple, the ILO, or simple to some extent, the ILO uses the following model to count child labor based on data sets, mainly household surveys from around 106 countries. So I've simplified it a little bit. Basically, those who are counted as child laborers are those children who, during the reference week of the labor survey, are aged 5 to 11, and have worked for more than 1 hour in any form of work except for unpaid household activities, are aged 12 to 17 years and have worked for more than 1 hour in one or more hazardous industries, mining, quarrying, construction, or hazardous occupations, are aged 12 to 14 years and have worked for 14 hours or more that week, even outside school hours or in holidays, or are aged 15 to 17 and have worked for more than 43 hours or 6 hours per day, no matter what kind of work they did. All right, so I think it's important to say here that no data is actually collected on the worst forms of child labor, like slavery, prostitution, forced labor, child soldiering. So if you read that half of the children in the world work in the worst forms, it actually means that they work in normal but hazardous work, right, in which their safety might be at risk, which is also in a technical way counted as one of the worst forms of child labor. It's not presented in that way, but that's what it means. So yeah, besides a very broad way of counting and excluding and including and excluding, there have been many studies done that make us believe that much of the national data underpinning the global estimates is actually very, very unreliable, right? And this is much to do with who we ask, when we ask, and how we ask. So ideally, the ILO wants governments to ask children themselves about their work, but in practice, this almost never happens because practical constraints, money, training, etc. And parents or other household members, so-called proxies, are usually asked about their children, right, and the work they do, which has huge consequences for the outcomes. And there's quite a lot of studies that show just how much would change if we ask differently or at a different time or to different people. So there's a study that was published in 2018 or 19 based on data in Ethiopia, which concluded that actually the timing, so whether it's in harvest season or not, could account for a change up to 76% in outcomes on child labor, and that actually sort of the gender aspect is very important. So as we ask fathers or male household members about the work that children do, it happens that it's systematically underreported. Another study that was done by a statistician this was in Tanzania, actually showed that if you actually ask children instead of the adult proxies, the results suggest that the prevalence increases by approximately 35 to 65%, which is huge, of course. And another example of a study that was conducted recently and published earlier this year, this was more about how we ask. So this researcher came up or sort of found the results that if you ask differently, so instead of just asking directly about like how did you employ working children, etc., if you put them in a list, so if you make it multiple option, basically the numbers vary, and the results suggest that the incidence is about twice as higher than if you would just ask them through a normal household. So all that to say that the numbers, even on national level, but then also certainly on the global level, are hugely inadequate and inaccurate. Which takes me to my conclusion, the sense and nonsense of the global estimates. And for this, I would just go back to the quote or what the ILO director Francis Blanchard wrote in 1983. And in this sense, I don't think that much has changed indeed. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to want to have data on child labor, good, solid data, even for the global scale, just to have an indication of what we are dealing with. But based on what I just presented, I think it's nonsense and even damaging to use the global estimates in the way that they're currently used. And I think it's wrong to propagate this shocking and sensationalist representation of child labor using the global estimates while there's actually no data on the worst forms. It's also wrong to present them as scientific solid data to measure or justify a global policy, in our case, the abolition of child labor. Therefore, it's interesting that the new numbers show a rise in child labor, and it's interesting to see if the ILO will now say that the approach is actually not working. Probably not, but it should make them ask themselves some questions. I would like to end there.